They say the most dangerous secrets aren't buried in vaults or hidden behind locked doors. They're the ones passed in silence, between glances, across borders, folded into memory like they never existed. Tonight, we're going back to the kind of moment history doesn't like to talk about. A quiet betrayal. A man who smiled, took notes, and handed over the keys to a weapon that changed the world. Not for money, not for power, but because he believed he was saving it. This isn't the story of a spy who got caught. It's the story of a spy who walked willingly into the lion's den and never flinched. If you've ever wondered what it takes to deceive entire governments, or how a single handshake in the fog can shift the balance of the Cold War, you're in the right place. But before we begin, if you like your history shadowed, slow burning, and full of quiet dread, consider liking and subscribing. This channel is for people who like to sit with the uncomfortable truth a little longer than most. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Are the lights on? Is the room still? Good. Then settle in. Because tonight, we follow the footprints of a man who stood at the edge of a world split by ideology and chose to set it on fire. What he gave away wasn't just information, it was time. Time the world thought it still had, and never got back. It began with rain, not the soft drizzle that made London feel like it was wrapped in wool, but the kind that struck glass like it was knocking to be let in, impatient, insistent, as though it knew secrets were about to spill. Inside the gray building on Curzon Street, 4 stories above the soaked pavement, the room was almost bare. Just a desk, 2 chairs, a single window fogged at the corners, no clocks, no portraits of monarchs or ministries. Just the kind of institutional stillness that felt planned, the kind that smothered noise and nudged the guilty toward their own confession. A man sat in the far chair, arms folded, his posture perfect. Gray suit, unfashionable. Black Oxfords polished to a dull gleam. Thin-rimmed spectacles rested on his nose, and he adjusted them once every few minutes, as if the ritual helped him stay grounded. His hair was neatly parted, graying at the temples. His name was Klaus Emil Julius Fuchs. He was 48 years old. Across from him, a man in a crisp MI5 suit closed the file slowly, like a priest shutting a Bible before the last rites. No shouting, no threats, just a final question, voiced with the eerie calm of a man who'd stopped hoping for a lie. Dr. Fuchs, did you pass information to the Soviets during your work on the atomic program? The room didn't move. The world seemed to hold its breath. Fuchs looked down for a moment, pressing his fingertips together as if measuring an equation. Then, slowly, without any trace of panic or hesitation, he raised his eyes. Yes, he said. It wasn't the confession that froze the air. It was the way he said it. Not defiant, not broken, not even burdened. Just matter of fact, like he was reading a list of elements off a chalkboard. There was no trembling in his voice, no darting eyes searching for escape. Only certainty. The MI5 man blinked. For a moment, his hand hovered above the recorder, as though unsure whether he was still dreaming. Then, he pressed the button. Begin recording. Subject present, Dr. Klaus Emil Fuchs. Location, Curzon Street headquarters. Time, 8/12, February 3rd, 1950. Click. Please explain your activities, Dr. Fuchs. Another pause. Another adjustment of the spectacles, rain ticking faster now. I began providing information in 1942. The first contacts were through the Communist Party. My belief at the time was, I did not believe it was right for one nation to hold such power alone. That was how it began. Not with sirens, not with handcuffs or shouts or slammed fists, but with a whisper. A man stepping out of the fog of loyalty, calmly admitting to handing over the West's most devastating scientific secrets, and not only admitting it, but explaining it like a man working through a formula. The MI5 officers would later describe it as surreal, like listening to a polite man confess to a bank robbery, except the vault was filled with hydrogen and uranium and the blood was spread across continents. And behind the walls of that quiet room, Panic had already begun to ripple through the British establishment. They had known Fuchs was suspicious, yes, watched him, whispered about him. But none of them, not even the most cynical, thought he would admit it without pressure, without bargaining, without so much as a nervous twitch. That was what made it terrifying. Not that he'd done it, but that he believed it was the right thing to do. The file was thick, and as the officer turned the pages, each detail landed like a fresh wound. Los Alamos, tube alloys, Trinity, every term touched with nuclear fire. And now, all of it, every formula, every breakthrough, every confidential breakthrough, had been mirrored in the East because of him. "Can you explain the methods you used?" "I met with a man named Harry Gold," Fuchs said, "in the United States. We exchanged information regularly. He had a system, prearranged phrases, signals in newspapers, changes in posture. I found it primitive but effective." He almost sounded amused. Outside, the rain had turned to sleet, streaking down the glass in cold, chalky lines. Fuchs looked at it for a moment, then back at the officer. "Why now?" the man asked. There was a pause. Then, for the first time, a flicker of something moved behind Fuchs's eyes. Not regret, not even guilt, something quieter. Weariness, maybe, or inevitability. "Because I've served my purpose," he said softly. "The balance exists now. The power is no longer in one hand. That's all I ever wanted." The interviewer felt a chill rise through him that had nothing to do with the weather. This man, this quiet, unremarkable physicist, had just admitted to reshaping the global power structure. Not for money, not for blackmail, but because he believed it was necessary, and he had never once been caught. Only now, at the end, had he chosen to speak. Not because he was outmaneuvered, but because he had calculated the moment, like any other equation. And this, in his mind, was simply the final variable. They let him keep speaking. For 7 hours, he detailed drop sites, described signals, named Soviet contacts. He outlined the curvature of a plutonium core with the same detachment a baker might use describing a recipe. "I passed that diagram on a Thursday, I believe. It was raining. I remember because I used the folded newspaper technique." "Which paper?" "The Daily Worker." The detail wasn't just disturbing, it was encyclopedic. Every piece of treason cataloged, filed, committed to memory, and he gave it all away with no resistance. That night, when Fuchs was led from the MI5 building in a coat borrowed from an officer, his own still soaked from the morning sleet, he didn't look defeated. He looked resolved. No cuffs, no spectacle, just a man stepping into a car like it was any other ride. He sat in silence the entire way to the holding facility. Once, the driver swore he heard him humming something under his breath, but couldn't place the tune. Somewhere between German lullaby and funeral dirge. The newspapers wouldn't get the story for days. Even when they did, they wouldn't believe the depth of it. A German-born British physicist, a refugee from Hitler's Reich, a celebrated contributor to the Allied nuclear effort, the man who handed the bomb to Stalin. It would take weeks for the pieces to surface, months for the Venona decrypts to confirm the Soviet connections, years for the full truth to unravel. But for now, only a handful of people in the world understood what had happened in that room. And one of them, the man who had calmly destroyed the balance of Western supremacy, had done so with the quiet conviction of a priest lighting a candle. The next morning, MI5 compiled a full transcript of the interrogation, 87 pages. At the bottom of the final sheet, where the signature went, Fuchs had written his name in a clear, deliberate hand. Beneath it, without being prompted, he had added a line. "I gave the Soviets what they would have taken anyway. I simply ensured it happened faster and more fairly." And below that, just before the ink dried, "I regret nothing." The story didn't end there. It hadn't even begun. Because before the confession, before the interrogations and the headlines and the outrage, there was the making of a man who believed betrayal was justice and silence was treason. And that story didn't start in a room in London. It began in Germany, in fire, in exile, in whispers behind locked doors, and in a single question that would haunt the Western world for decades to come. How do you stop a traitor who believes he's saving you? The windowpane rattled softly in the night wind, and somewhere, deep in the belly of the MI5 archives, a typewriter began to tap. The tap of the typewriter lingers like the tick of a detonator. One keystroke after another, deliberate and final. Names, dates, codes, places where secrets passed like whispers through gloved hands. The confessor sits silent, still, while the sound of the machine burrows deeper into the silence he's created. He has detonated something, yes, but not in that room. Not yet. That explosion was years in the making, built not with uranium or plutonium, but with loneliness, betrayal, and quiet decisions made under dark skies. The story doesn't begin in a cell or an MI5 office. It begins long before there were walls to confine him. It begins in a town where snow fell gently in the winter and the shadows on the cobblestones grew longer with each year. Eisenach, 1911. The boy was born beneath the weight of a name too proud for a child and into a family already at war with the world, not with guns or knives, but with ideas. Emil Fuchs was a Lutheran minister, but not the kind who preached fire and brimstone. Emil believed peace was not a prayer, but a duty. He was the kind of man who stood in a crowd when the crowd roared for violence and said no. In that time and place, that was the same as betrayal. And Klaus, his youngest son, learned early that even the right convictions could make you an outcast. He remembered watching his father speak at meetings, remembered how the room would grow tense, not out of anger, but fear. The words Emil used were simple: do not harm, do not kill, do not hate. Yet, somehow, those were the most dangerous words of all. It was not just that Emil Fuchs was a pacifist in a world preparing for war. It was that he insisted his children believed the same. Klaus learned young that to survive meant learning to hide parts of himself. By the time he was 10, he knew how to make himself small, how to disappear in a room. He was brilliant. His teachers all said so, but it was the wrong kind of brilliance. He didn't laugh at the right jokes. He didn't look the part of a good German boy. And worse still, when the boys in school shouted slogans and songs of empire, Klaus stayed silent. He tried to make sense of it in numbers. Mathematics was clean, safe, cold. There were no mobs in algebra, no fists in equations. His notebooks became the only places where the world made sense. Numbers didn't ask questions. They didn't betray you. But the world wasn't interested in equations. It was tearing itself apart. By the time Klaus was a teenager, the Weimar Republic was collapsing like a rotted scaffold. Food grew scarce, riots flared, and into the cracks marched something darker than hunger: certainty. The Nazis did not offer food. They offered meaning. They gave the boys in his class a reason to hate, a uniform to wear, a chant to repeat. And soon, even those who had once shared sandwiches with Klaus on school benches were joining Youth Corps, carving swastikas into wood desks with knives. The betrayal wasn't dramatic. It was slow. It started with whispered jokes about Jews. Then his sister was harassed in the marketplace. Then his father's church was vandalized. Then the Nazi flag replaced the town's crest. And Klaus, he did nothing. Not because he agreed, but because he was watching, calculating. His elder brother did not watch. He joined. The man who had once held Klaus's hand across frozen streets now wore a uniform stitched with insignia, and when their mother asked how this could happen, his brother answered with quiet authority, "This is the future. Klaus needs to choose." But Klaus had already chosen. He found his way to Marxist reading groups, quiet ones, dangerous ones. They didn't speak loudly, but their silence was louder than any chant. It wasn't ideology that drew Klaus in. It was the sense that someone else saw the world breaking too. The communists didn't promise glory or pride. They promised resistance. He read late into the night, Engels, Marx, Lenin, while the walls of Germany grew higher and the air turned electric with fear. Klaus wasn't a fighter, not in the traditional sense. He didn't shout, he didn't throw bricks, but he remembered details. He memorized train schedules, police rotations, the names of books banned before they were published. He didn't see this as subversion, he saw it as math. The numbers were off. The equation of the state no longer worked. Then, one night, the knock came. It wasn't for him. It was for a friend. A boy he had met in one of those late-night gatherings, someone who had passed him a mimeographed page under a library table. Klaus was supposed to meet him that evening. Instead, the Gestapo came. They took the boy from his bed, ransacked his family's flat, and left the mother screaming on the landing. Klaus didn't sleep that night. He didn't return to his room. He burned his notebooks, burned them himself, watching the equations curl into ash. Then he ran, took the boy from his bed, ransacked his family's flat, and left the mother screaming on the landing. Klaus didn't sleep that night. He didn't return to his room. He burned his notebooks, burned them himself, watching the equations curl into ash. Then he ran. There was no plan, no network, no farewell, just a train. He boarded it with nothing but a coat and a forged student card. He watched the city fall away behind him, its churches and chimneys swallowed by mist. He didn't look back. He couldn't. The fog blurred everything, including the future. He crossed borders in silence, feigning innocence, feigning ignorance. Each checkpoint was a coin toss, but he had one weapon: anonymity. Klaus Fuchs was no one, a student, a son, a blur. When he arrived in England, it was not a triumph. It was cold and rain. He stepped off the train and stood there, alone, soaked, invisible. A stranger in a land that didn't want him. No family, no language, no roots, just one thing: a mind like a blade. He enrolled in university. Physics. The world around him boiled with politics, but in the lab there was only precision. He buried himself in theory, in particles and probabilities, in a new kind of truth. Professors noted his brilliance, but even they couldn't quite place him. He was polite, distant, always watching, always a few words short of warmth. And yet, something inside him burned. Not for revenge, for justice. Back in Germany, the Nazis were burning books. His brother, he learned, had risen in the ranks. And the friend, the one taken by the Gestapo, was never seen again. Klaus tried to silence those memories, but they stayed. In lectures, in dreams, in the hiss of gas through laboratory valves. Then, one evening, in a pub near the university, he overheard a conversation. Not about physics, about Spain, Franco's fascist coup. British students were debating whether to go fight. The room was split, voices sharp. Klaus said nothing. Then one turned to him and asked, "What do you think?" He answered finally, "I think if you wait too long to fight, you won't get the chance." The room went silent. From that moment, he was not just the quiet German physicist. He was something else, something dangerous. Invitations began to arrive, not to parties, but to meetings. He declined at first, but one night, after too much whiskey and too little sleep, he said yes, and it began again. The quiet rooms, the shared names, the questions. Not about theory, but about belief. He met others who had escaped, Poles, Spaniards, even disillusioned Britons, and among them, a man whose name he never learned, only a code name. The man spoke softly, never wrote anything down, and had a way of making every answer sound like a choice. He never asked Klaus to spy. He didn't need to. He only asked, "If you knew something that could stop them, would you tell us?" It was hypothetical, but it wasn't. And Klaus, brilliant, soft-spoken Klaus, nodded. That night, he walked home with the question still ringing in his ears. He told himself it wasn't treason. Treason required loyalty. He had none left, not to the Reich, not to the institutions that stood silent while his friends were taken. The only thing he believed in now was that fascism must be stopped. By any means, at any cost. It wasn't a grand decision. No oath, no ceremony, just a flicker of resolve. And so it began, not with a bang, but with a whisper. The whisper would become a wave. It would cross oceans. It would split atoms. It would change the world. But for now, it was still inside him, quiet as a prayer, cold as winter rain. He hadn't spoken to the man again. He didn't have to. The train had left the station. The past was behind him. And the future would be written in fire. It began not with a handshake or a code word, but with barbed wire and a number stitched to a shirt. A name erased and replaced by a label, Enemy Alien. The man who had once fled tyranny in Germany now stood behind a British fence in 1940, reduced to a foreign liability by the country he had trusted to shelter him. Klaus Fuchs watched the guards pass each morning with their rifles slung low and their boots crunching gravel. It was cold in the Isle of Man internment camp, and colder still inside his bones. He didn't know it yet, but this was the first step in becoming invisible. The perfect cover was not a disguise. It was truth buried beneath survival. No one suspected the physicist in the wire cage would one day hand over the secrets of the universe to Stalin. When he was arrested, there had been no trial, no accusation of action, just suspicion by origin. German by birth, and therefore dangerous, no matter his exile from the Nazis, no matter the ideology that had driven him out. He had been caught in the dragnet when the British government began rounding up foreign nationals, fearing infiltration by Nazi spies. That he had once fled those very same Nazis made no difference. He stood on the wrong side of the line. The camp was full of contradictions: Jewish intellectuals, political refugees, anti-fascists, anarchists, poets, broken businessmen, and mixed among them real sympathizers of Hitler's dream, whose accents and rage masked deeper alliances. It was a pressure cooker with no logic, only containment. Days blurred into one another, and Klaus began to vanish from himself. His mind clawed for equations to preserve sanity, calculating imaginary nuclear trajectories in the back of his thoughts. It wasn't just to pass time, it was escape. The real danger wasn't the camp. It was what the camp did to belief. Every day he watched ideologies snap like piano wire. Men who had resisted the Reich started muttering about the futility of resistance. Men who had once denounced Hitler now whispered that perhaps the old order hadn't been so bad, that perhaps, if you had money or status, fascism could be tolerable. But not for Klaus. If anything, the camp radicalized him further. Behind the fences, under watch, a seed sprouted, a cold clarity. Britain had saved him, yes, but now it caged him. The class system here was subtler, cloaked in custom, but just as sharp as the boots he had fled. In Germany, the swastika hunted his ideas. In England, the bureaucracy numbed them. Both feared truth, both feared change. And Klaus silently began to choose a third path. He was released after months of petitioning from colleagues and a thin trickle of wartime desperation. Britain needed scientists, even those with suspect surnames. He walked out of the camp thinner, quieter, more determined. He returned to his research as if nothing had happened, as if the months behind wire had been a fever dream. But the fire that had driven him into exile now burned more focused. He would survive not through rebellion, but by perfection. His disguise would not be a fake accent or a forged passport. It would be total immersion into British life. The spy who leaves no ripple is the one who never splashes. He buried his communist leanings under layers of calm rationality. He stopped attending meetings. He severed direct ties. He got his naturalization papers. No one questioned his allegiance, not his neighbors, who saw a polite, diligent man with a fondness for long walks, not his colleagues, who saw only the mind. And that mind, so precise, so tireless, was exactly what the British war machine needed. His previous affiliations were quietly ignored, smoothed over by war's endless appetite for intellect. A former refugee with impeccable mathematical skills? Good enough. The risk they thought was minimal, but Fuchs hadn't severed all connections. The underground was patient and loyal. One evening in 1941, in a crowded cafe near Bloomsbury, a stranger sat beside him and asked the time. Their hands brushed as he leaned forward. Nothing unusual. No one noticed. But when Fuchs stood to leave, a folded piece of thick paper was tucked beneath the edge of his sleeve. No note, no name. Inside, a strip of microfilm barely wider than a fingernail. It was the first drop. He never spoke of it. He never mentioned it to anyone, even years later. But something in him had changed that day. He had crossed a threshold. He wasn't working against Britain, not in his own mind. He believed he was balancing scales, correcting a deadly asymmetry. The West, he was sure, would never share the secrets of atomic power with the Soviet Union. And if it didn't, the world would be held hostage by one ideology. The others would become shadows. Klaus didn't trust power in any one set of hands. It wasn't treason, it was equilibrium. His work gained speed. He was soon brought into Britain's most secretive scientific initiative, the Tube Alloys Project, their attempt to build an atomic bomb. He worked under luminaries and alongside unknown names that would one day carve their place into history. He refined calculations about chain reactions, neutron capture, critical mass. The mathematics of destruction filtered through quiet chalk strokes and soft hums of fluorescent lights. And all the while, no one suspected. His reports were flawless, his behavior modest. He spoke softly, never boasted, and rarely argued. He wore his Britishness like an old coat, not flashy, but familiar. His accent had dulled into neutral. His Germanness faded behind the long hours and soft-spoken corrections. He became the background, unremarkable, essential. But the microfilms kept coming, not frequently, never predictable. A gesture here, a pause at a bench, a note pinned under a newspaper. He never met the same courier twice. He didn't ask where the information went. He only believed it would reach the right hands, the ones that would prevent monopoly, the ones that would level the playing field. Then came the invitation that would tilt the earth beneath him. In 1943, with Britain and the United States aligning their atomic ambitions, a new directive emerged. Select scientists from Tube Alloys would be transferred to a joint project overseas. It was called Manhattan. It had no public name, no press, just urgency, secrecy, scale, and Fuchs, with his precision and quiet compliance, was selected. It was an honor, they told him, a testament to his value. He nodded politely. He packed his things. He wrote no letters. When the train pulled away from the station, no one waved goodbye. He had fooled them all. The British government, eager to prove its cooperation, handed over dossiers of their top physicists. The Americans, suspicious but in need of talent, scanned them. Fuchs's file was clean, his background vetted, his presence approved. No one knew that the man they were sending into the heart of the bomb was already holding a second allegiance, one built not on nation, but on belief. And in the mirror of the train car, as trees blurred into a smear of green and black, Fuchs stared at his reflection and wondered how many layers a person could wear before they vanished entirely. The man in the suit was Klaus, but also not Klaus, a scientist, a ghost, a key, soon to be inserted into the deadliest lock in history. Behind him, Britain exhaled, thinking it had one fewer problem to manage. Ahead of him, America waited, unaware that inside its fortress, it was about to welcome the most dangerous man it would never see coming. He had never been to New Mexico before. The desert was alien, jagged mesas, hard sun, air that baked everything still. There were no cathedrals here, no European streets or narrow alleys like the ones he remembered from Bristol or Berlin. Just wind and sand, a new world scraped down to its elemental truths. And somewhere in that scorched landscape, hidden behind chain-link fences and armed patrols, they were building the thing that would end the war and, quietly, begin another. Klaus Fuchs stepped off the train at Lamy Station with a suitcase in one hand and the burden of 2 nations in the other. No one on the platform knew him, but in 5 years, he would be the most damaging spy in modern history. And it would all begin here, under the most sacred secret the United States had ever constructed, the Manhattan Project. He was cleared without hesitation. Security badges were printed, a file created, and an escort arranged for the drive to the Los Alamos compound. Inside the car, a military intelligence officer made small talk, unaware that the man in the passenger seat had already passed atomic secrets to Soviet operatives from London to Brooklyn. Klaus sat silently, absorbing the parched terrain, noting everything: the checkpoint intervals, the layout of the roads, the guard routines. He was a physicist, yes, but he had also become something else: a courier of power, a conduit between worlds, a man building the bomb for one country and handing it piece by piece to another. Oppenheimer welcomed him personally. Klaus was introduced not as an outsider, but as a trusted British asset, a specialist in theoretical physics, particularly neutron behavior in fissionable materials. Within days, he was reading classified memos, running calculations for critical mass, and consulting with the very architects of the plutonium implosion design. Every night, he returned to his quarters in the barracks, and every night he remembered what he had sworn himself to. The Soviets had to know. The Americans could not be the only ones. It began again with codes, not emails, not radios. They used paper. Slips tucked into hollowed-out rocks, chemical-treated ink that vanished under heat. The old ways. Fuchs would memorize equations during the day, transcribe them by hand in the early hours, and then incinerate his notes in the stove while others slept. His handler, Harry Gold, appeared with disturbing regularity, sometimes at remote bus stops, sometimes outside dental offices, sometimes in alleys that stank of spilled beer and heat. Their meetings were wordless more often than not. The drop was the only conversation. A folded map, a cigarette box, a chewing gum wrapper sealed with wax. Inside those drops were the future: schematics for the Trinity test, yield estimations, the differences between uranium gun-type bombs and the far more complex implosion-type plutonium device. The Soviets, and only a handful inside the Kremlin truly knew this, were months ahead of schedule solely because of what Klaus was delivering. His reach extended deeper than even he realized, and still no one suspected him. They liked him. That was the unbearable part. Hans Bethe called him brilliant. Teller trusted him implicitly. He played chess in the evenings, joked about the dryness of the air, shared coffee with lab technicians. One woman sent him letters after the war, friendly ones, recalling how quiet and thoughtful he'd been, how he never raised his voice. In every way that mattered, Klaus had become invisible, camouflaged inside science, absorbed into patriotism, hidden beneath formulas and equations that no one outside the compound could understand. But behind that mask, he was bleeding every ounce of nuclear theory across an invisible line drawn from Los Alamos to Moscow. The burden grew. Every day he ran numbers on energy release, on neutron reflectors, on tamper designs. And every day he remembered what it all meant. It wasn't just about balance. He told himself that, but the truth clawed at him each night. He wasn't just evening the playing field. He was shifting it, tearing it apart atom by atom. The ideology had once been clean: resistance to fascism, belief in equality, distrust of empire. But now the ideology had a kill radius. Now it came with radiation sickness and firestorms and shadow burns on walls where people used to stand. Then came their test, July 16th, 1945. Trinity. The sky over New Mexico tore itself open at 5:29 a.m. Fuchs was not at ground zero. He didn't need to be. The reports alone told the story. A light brighter than the sun. A mushroom cloud rising 40,000 feet. The desert turned to glass. And deep in his chest, Klaus felt something he hadn't expected. Not pride, not even guilt. Something emptier. A realization that science had become theology. That men were building gods and then putting timers on them. He copied the after-action report 3 nights later. It contained everything: yield data, blast radius, thermal pulse, neutron flux. It described the fireball, the shockwave, the crater. It was the Bible of modern apocalypse, and he sent it east, page by page. The Soviets received it with disbelief. Then, with urgency, then with acceleration. But the real silence came after Hiroshima. August 6th, 1945, Hiroshima. The city ceased to exist in under 45 seconds. 80,000 dead before noon. Shadows burned into concrete. The streets were gone. Bodies evaporated where they stood. Klaus was in Los Alamos when they heard the news. A cheer went up in the dining hall. Fists slammed tables. Someone popped open a bottle. But Klaus sat there, motionless, his fork hanging midair. The mission had succeeded. The war might be over. But what had they done? 3 days later, Nagasaki. Another bomb, another city, another 100,000. He had sent the mechanisms. He had handed them the math. And now, entire populations were numbers. Entire cities were footnotes. He walked the perimeter of the lab that night for hours. The wind howled through the fences. The sky was indifferent. And somewhere in his mind, he wondered, had he done the right thing? Was deterrence really protection? Or had he merely multiplied the coming violence? The next drop was not immediate. Harry Gold didn't appear for weeks. When he did, he was shaken. Stalin had not anticipated the scale. There were internal debates now, moral ones, even among the Soviets. They had wanted parity, not this. But the machine had begun. It could not be slowed. In the months that followed, Klaus grew thinner. He wrote less in his letters home. He stopped going to chess matches. The silence became ritual. His calculations, though, remained sharp, and still no one suspected. The Americans, bloated on victory, assumed the Soviets were years behind. They toasted Truman's strength. They spoke of a new order. But Fuchs knew otherwise. The secrets had already crossed the ocean. He left Los Alamos in late 1946. By then, the bombs had been tested, the war had ended, and the Cold War had begun without anyone naming it. Klaus was reassigned back to Britain, a hero in quiet corners, a foreigner now naturalized, a scientist whose contributions had supposedly ended war. But there were nights he couldn't sleep, nights where the desert came back in dreams, nights when he saw that flash again, the one from Trinity, and wondered if it was still rising somewhere, still casting a light across a world unprepared to survive what it had created. He had given the Soviets the bomb, and the Americans would find out. But not yet. For now he walked among them, unseen, unknown, holding the weight of what he had done in every step, knowing that the worst had only just begun. The air was heavy in Washington. It wasn't the humidity, not this time. It was August 29th, 1949, and the world had just changed. There had been no warning, no countdown, no chest-beating display from the Soviets. Only a faint tremor in the Kazakh steppe, ripples in the atmosphere, a mushroom-shaped bruise blooming over the desert. The Americans knew the shape of that bruise too well. It meant someone had stolen the most terrible thing they'd ever built. The Soviets had the bomb, and no one was ready for it. When the signal from seismic monitors reached the Pentagon, they didn't believe it at first. The CIA said the Soviets were at least 5 years away. Truman's advisors scoffed, until U-2 flights confirmed it. Until the coded radio chatter across the Soviet Far East intensified. Until British scientists with sensitive detection equipment caught the chemical signature of detonated plutonium drifting westward in the jet stream. And it matched what the Americans themselves had used. That's when everything stopped. Phones rang, files vanished, locks changed. Because someone had given Stalin the blueprints for hell. The first whisper didn't come from Langley or the White House. It came from a small, cramped office on the second floor of a drab, windowless building tucked in Arlington, Virginia. Room 5B, the hub of something so secret it didn't officially exist, the Venona Project. For 3 years, a silent team of codebreakers, linguists, mathematicians, exiled Russians, and cryptographic savants had been feeding reams of intercepted Soviet diplomatic cable traffic through battered machines and human minds. Most of it was gibberish. Some of it was poetry. And then one line came through, a ghost from 1944, just a fragment of a decrypted Soviet message, something about an asset inside the Manhattan Project, an asset they called Charles. No last name, no photograph, just the code name, buried in a transmission from the Soviet consulate in New York to Moscow Center. The Americans didn't even know the real value of what they'd intercepted. Not yet. But someone in British intelligence did. The signal crossed the Atlantic by courier, not wire. Too sensitive for radio. In Whitehall, it landed on the desk of Sir Percy Sillitoe, the Director General of MI5, who was already nursing a storm. Britain's post-war intelligence community was in chaos. The empire was shrinking. The colonies were rebelling. The Soviets were winning hearts in the Labour Party. And now this, a mole inside the very project that created the atomic bomb. Percy stared at the decrypted message. The word Charles glowed in the fluorescent light like a bullet without a gun. He didn't know the caliber yet, but he knew someone had pulled the trigger. Inside MI5's counterintelligence branch, the hunt began, quietly. They couldn't afford a scandal. Not yet. Not after the Philby rumors, not after the disaster in Greece, and not with a socialist government nervous about being accused of anti-communist purging. So they created a task force inside a task force. Only 4 men knew the full truth. They called it Operation Pryor, and they began by reviewing the guest list of British scientists who had worked at Los Alamos. Dozens of names. A few stood out. But one lingered, like smoke that won't leave the room. Klaus Emil Julius Fuchs. He'd been in the United States. He'd had access to theoretical design documents, to the implosion models, to the critical mass equations. He wasn't flashy. He didn't drink. He didn't talk too much. Everyone described him as quiet, reliable, a little sad, maybe lonely, but brilliant. The kind of man who solved problems others hadn't even noticed yet. The kind of man who had reasons to hide. In a locked archive in London, they pulled his naturalization file. It was clean. Too clean. A German refugee, academic references, no known affiliations. But the year of his internment stuck out, 1940. He had been held on the Isle of Man, later released on recommendation from respected scientists, and from there, he'd joined the British atomic energy effort, then transferred to America. Seamless, flawless, almost surgical. But then came a mistake. In a memo buried in a 1947 personnel review, Fuchs had listed a contact address for a post office box in Philadelphia, an unusual choice for a British scientist stationed mostly in New Mexico. MI5 flagged it. Quiet inquiries followed. They discovered that the box was registered under a different name, Harold Gold, or rather, Harry Gold, a name that rang bells for American counterintelligence. Harry Gold had been on their radar before, not for espionage, but for something stranger. During the war, he had worked as a chemist in Pennsylvania, and once been seen frequenting known communist bookshops. That wasn't enough to charge him, but enough to keep a file open. When MI5 asked the FBI to reopen that file in light of the Venona lead, something clicked. In late 1948, they started tailing Gold. A quiet man, lived alone, wrote letters to no one, carried a brown leather satchel that he never let go of. They followed him to a hotel lobby in Manhattan, where he sat for 30 minutes, looking nervous. When he left, he no longer had the satchel, and the man who picked it up was never identified. But he looked, by one account, European, older, gaunt. When they checked Gold's bank records, they found a sudden deposit 2 days later. No job, no explanation. Then another coincidence, this one almost laughable. Gold had once applied for work at a company subcontracting for Los Alamos. His application had been rejected, but he'd kept notes that mentioned scientists he was hoping to get to know. One name, Dr. Fuchs. In late December 1948, Harry Gold made one last trip to New York. He stayed in a hotel in Queens, left 3 times, always to the same park bench. Each time, he waited alone, never meeting anyone. But on the 3rd night, witnesses said they saw him leave with a folded envelope tucked into his coat. What was inside, no one knows for sure. But what happened next was certain. Gold disappeared from active surveillance for 4 weeks. The FBI lost him. MI5 couldn't help, but Fuchs was back in England by January 1949, working at Harwell, one of Britain's top nuclear research facilities. He was still trusted, still praised, still unexposed. And yet, something was beginning to unspool inside him. The Cold War had changed. It was no longer about the memory of fascism or the promise of proletarian unity. It was about rockets and airfields and whose city would burn first. Fuchs had watched Hiroshima from a distance, safe in New Mexico, knowing exactly what had happened the moment the code word "little boy successful" had crackled over the wire. But he hadn't expected the second bomb. Nagasaki broke something in him. And in those quiet months after the war, while Britain celebrated peace, Fuchs walked home from Harwell each night in silence. He knew what he'd done, but more haunting than the past was what he feared was coming. By summer of 1949, Operation Pryor had narrowed its list. Fuchs was still only a name, but the weight on that name was growing. Then, one day, a Russian defector in Istanbul, unconnected to the case, mentioned a strange anecdote. A scientist who had passed secrets to the Soviets in Los Alamos. A scientist still in Britain. He couldn't remember the name, but he said the code they used for him was the clerk. The file landed on Percy Silito's desk with one word underlined 3 times: urgent. The Americans demanded action, but the British hesitated. If they accused and were wrong, the scandal could shatter the Anglo-American atomic alliance. But if they waited and Fuchs slipped away, they might never find the leak again. MI5 decided on a middle path. They wouldn't arrest. They'd invite. They'd watch his face. And so, in the gray chill of January 1950, Klaus Fuchs received a letter requesting his presence at a routine debriefing regarding his time in America. He showed up, neatly dressed, on time, calm, smiled politely, answered the first 30 questions with professional detachment. But when they brought up Venona, when they said they had intercepted Soviet messages with reference to a scientist, his fingers began to tremble. Not his voice, not his posture, just his hands, a tremor, like a leaf that's been holding still for too long. And then they asked about Harry Gold. He didn't speak for 12 seconds. MI5 counted. When he finally opened his mouth, the words came in German accented English, quiet, composed. I believe I know who that is. They didn't press. 2 days later, without warning, Klaus Fuchs returned to the same MI5 building and asked to speak with someone in private. He carried no lawyer, no briefcase, just a folded piece of paper with a list of names, dates, locations, and a single sentence written at the bottom in his own hand. I did this because I believed it was right. It wasn't a confession, not yet, but it was a fracture. And through that fracture, history began to change. Because what Fuchs didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that his name was already on another list. A list compiled months earlier by a quiet unit inside the CIA. A list of suspects connected to Charles. A list that was now headed for Washington. And on that list, Klaus Fuchs sat underlined in red. The race was over. The mole had been identified, but the reckoning, the consequences of what he had already given, had only just begun. The room was too quiet. Not the silence of peace, but the kind of quiet that makes your skin feel thin. Klaus Fuchs sat at the edge of a wooden chair that was older than the room itself. The walls were papered in a dull green that did little to mask the cold, and across from him sat a man whose eyes smiled, but whose hands didn't move once. It was a Tuesday morning in 1949, and London was wrapped in a fog that never quite left the streets, a fog that now seemed to settle inside his lungs. The man's voice was polite, casual, almost friendly. Just a few questions about his time in the United States, his scientific work, his war contributions, his memories. The questions were not accusatory, nor were they insistent. That made it worse, because each time Klaus answered, he knew they were not listening to the content. They were watching the shape of the answer, the pause before a word, the flicker in his eye, the moment he glanced toward the door before saying something he thought might sound wrong. He left the building with his coat clutched too tightly and a smile too practiced. Outside, no one followed, at least not obviously, but inside his chest something had cracked open. The meeting had lasted under 30 minutes, but for the rest of that week, Klaus Fuchs couldn't stop hearing the man's voice. It repeated in his dreams, just one particular question echoing back again and again like a dropped pin in a vault. Did you ever communicate scientific details to foreign nationals? Such an innocent phrase, crafted like origami, folded and folded until the blade inside could not be seen. He had smiled when he answered, drawing up the energy of every lecture he'd ever given to students who knew less than they thought they did. "No," he had said, "I never discussed technical matters outside official channels." The man had nodded, noted something, and said nothing. Back in Harwell, where he now worked as a theoretical physicist on Britain's own nuclear program, Klaus sat longer in his office. He left his desk drawer slightly ajar, as if expecting it to be searched. He removed the letters he used to keep there, the ones from Germany, the ones from old comrades in the Communist Party, the ones from no one at all that he used to read to feel like someone somewhere still understood why he'd done what he did. He burned them. Each night he returned to his small home, closed the curtains, turned on the radio, and listened for the news he hoped would never come. MI5 did not accuse him, not yet, but they tapped his telephone. They watched his movements. They studied the pattern of his footsteps as he walked to work, as if the rhythm itself might betray him. They visited his colleagues with unrelated questions. They inquired gently about his behavior, his temperament, whether he ever seemed nervous. Most said no, but one said yes, just once, and that was all they needed to continue. Fuchs, in the meantime, grew quieter. He wrote long letters to himself at night, filled with self-criticism, theoretical musings, fragments of justification wrapped in philosophical questions that no longer made sense even to him. He stopped looking in mirrors. He couldn't bear to see the eyes that had lied to so many people who had trusted him. In the United States, Harry Gold had become a file number, a set of fingerprints, and a quiet priority. Under the alias Henry Griss, he had continued his life for several years in Philadelphia, keeping low, keeping out of anything that could trigger attention. But the net was not only closing in England. The FBI's Venona project had already decrypted a key message that referenced a man codenamed Charles, and the more they looked into it, the more it pointed towards someone who had worked at Los Alamos, someone with a British accent, someone precise, someone cautious. They didn't have a name, but the mosaic was forming. And then a customs agent noticed something strange. It began with a trivial smuggling investigation. Chemicals listed on a freight manifest didn't match what was in the container. Names were checked, calls made. Harry Gold's name surfaced in the process of tracing secondary contacts. And one agent, bored but methodical, looked into it. The man who had once delivered stolen atomic secrets wrapped in sugar boxes and map tubes was now about to be unwrapped himself. On May 23, 1950, Harry Gold was arrested by the FBI. He said nothing at first, but they had enough. And then they brought up the name Emil Klaus Fuchs. Harry's silence broke. In London, a decision was made. There would be one final meeting. It had to look ordinary. The location chosen was one Fuchs knew well, a plain office in a government building where he'd been consulted before on scientific advisory matters. The letter inviting him was polite. They even offered to pay his travel fare. When he entered the room, there were no cuffs, no accusations, no guards. Just a manila folder and a very quiet man who said hello like they were old friends. They let Fuchs speak first. He asked what the meeting was about. The reply was vague. Scientific matters, a reassessment of nuclear security, perhaps clarifications about procedures during his time in the U.S. The room was cool, the window shut, the folder was thick, and it lay in front of him, unopened. The man tapped it once with his finger and said nothing. When they finally began the real questions, it felt different. There was no threat, just a curious, meticulous rhythm that moved faster than before. "Did you ever meet with a man named Harry Gold?" Pause. "In the United States?" Another pause. "Or later, perhaps in England?" The pauses were not empty. They were calculations. Time to let Fuchs run the math in his head, to imagine how much they knew, to guess whether he could lie once more and survive. But the folder was there, and when they finally opened it, he saw the first page. It was a photograph, not of him, but of Harry. Then another, a transcript of a conversation, a schematic, and then his name. Typed, signed, confirmed. His hands trembled, only slightly. He reached for the glass of water beside him and missed by an inch. No one moved to help. He adjusted his glasses, blinked slowly, and asked whether he could take a moment. The interviewer agreed. Time was on their side. When Fuchs stepped out into the hallway, he didn't breathe for 5 full seconds. The air was dry. When he returned, he sat down and said 5 words that would alter the course of Cold War history. "I'd like to make a statement." He spoke for 3 hours, not at once, but in pieces. The words spilled out unevenly. He named times, places, people. He recounted his motivations, not as a confession, but as a justification. He described how he believed he was preventing a nuclear monopoly, how the world needed balance, how if only one nation had the bomb, it would use it. He said it had been about peace, about preventing war. The interviewer let him speak, then circled back, pointed out inconsistencies. Fuchs backtracked, adjusted, admitted more. They met again the next day, and the next. Each time, Fuchs was more worn, more detached. He began to narrate events like a historian, recounting another man's crimes. He spoke of the subject as if it were not himself. But each time he was shown more pages, more documents, more transcripts, he stopped pretending. By the 5th meeting, he was filling in details they hadn't even asked for. In one moment of eerie clarity, he said that after Hiroshima, he had walked alone for nearly 4 hours without direction, unable to face anyone at Los Alamos. He said he realized then that he had not prevented catastrophe. He had accelerated it, and yet he hadn't stopped. The Soviets asked for more. He gave more. The science was there. The secrecy was gone. It had become a reflex, something that no longer felt like betrayal, but like duty. A twisted sense of equilibrium. Back in the MI5 offices, analysts were reviewing the transcripts daily. Everything Fuchs said was verified, cross-checked, aligned with Venona traffic, U.S. reports, even Soviet defectors' whispers. And slowly, the full picture came into view. The damage was not just scientific. It was diplomatic, psychological, strategic. The entire post-war balance of power had been distorted by a man who never raised his voice, never acted erratically, never stood out. Klaus Fuchs had been the perfect spy precisely because he had been so ordinary. On January 27, 1950, the confession was complete. A statement was signed. Fuchs looked down at his name and traced it with his finger before lifting the pen. He didn't ask what would happen next. He already knew. Outside the interrogation room, a quiet phone call was placed to Washington. The man on the other end simply said, "It's confirmed." In the files, a red stamp was added, "Highly damaging." And in Moscow, somewhere inside a room with no name, a man read a translated version of the confession and did not smile. Fuchs was arrested formally that evening. The news didn't break immediately. For now, the British government wanted silence, order, containment. But the noose that had been tightening for months had finally closed. And somewhere in the United States, Julius Rosenberg's phone was ringing. Under a gray February sky in 1950, inside a modest MI5 interview room where the silence was colder than the walls, a man sat alone. No handcuffs, no raised voices, no visible sweat. He was calm, eerily so. Klaus Fuchs, the man whose betrayal had shifted the balance of the Cold War, whose fingerprints were now smeared across the history of espionage and nuclear politics, did not flinch when they slid the file across the table. His eyes, pale and unblinking, landed on the cover. He recognized the thickness. It was not the surprise that troubled him. It was the certainty. Everything had finally arrived where it had always been heading. He tapped the folder gently, then looked up. There was no fear in his expression, no panic, only resignation, laced with something deeper, conviction. The officer across from him, William Scarden, MI5 interrogator, had prepared for everything: denial, aggression, pleading, silence. He had studied the Soviet spy playbook, had gone over the rehearsed defenses Fuchs might use. What he had not prepared for was what came next. Fuchs opened the folder, skimmed the top pages, and then, in a voice steady enough to sound rehearsed but warm enough to feel almost conversational, said, "I will tell you everything." And then he did. Not in fragments, not with hesitation, not with the fragmented trauma of a man unraveling under guilt, but with an eerie clarity that made the walls seem thinner, the room smaller, the Cold War closer. The moment he began speaking, time seemed to fold inwards. Scarden, pen in hand, leaned forward, his training overridden by sheer astonishment. Fuchs wasn't being broken. He was being thorough. He began with names, not to implicate others, but to build a precise chronology. "My first contact," he said evenly, "was a man named Hans Kahle. He introduced me to the Comintern. That was in Paris." The dates matched MI5's rough sketches, but it wasn't just the names that shook them. It was the ease with which he stitched the past together. From 1933 to 1950, every city, every code name, every drop was poured out like water from a cup that had been filled for too long. He spoke of the switch to the Soviet NKVD, how he had been handled by Alexander Foote, then by Anatoly Yakovlev. Each handler, each transition, marked not by coercion, but by ideological trust. "It was not the Soviet Union I trusted," Fuchs said. "It was the idea that no one power should hold absolute strength. You think it was betrayal, I think it was prevention." The room felt colder now. Scarden's hand trembled slightly as he wrote. The confession was not the climax. It was the unraveling of the world they thought they understood. Fuchs detailed how he passed blueprints of the gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge, how he summarized bomb yield data, even how he described the implosion mechanisms tested at Los Alamos. "I didn't just give them information," he said. "I gave them balance." There was no anger in his voice, no remorse either, just precision. For every transfer to Harry Gold, for every letter passed in code, Fuchs had a memory that felt mathematical in its order. January 1945, New York City, a room above a bookstore. I handed him the final diagram, the Fat Man design. He paused then, not for dramatic effect, but because it was the only moment where memory seemed to touch emotion. "I knew what I was doing. I believed the Americans would use it, and they did. I believed others should have it, and they did." Scarden looked at his colleague. They were not in control of the room. Fuchs was. At one point, the silence became so thick, it felt like the interrogation had inverted. Scarden, MI5's practiced extractor of secrets, looked as though he had been caught in a net. Fuchs, emotionless and unhurried, was not a prisoner unraveling. He was an ideologue explaining. He even reached into the past, not with regret, but with purpose. "If the bomb had remained in your hands alone, the world would have split irreparably. I did not prevent war, but I made sure it was not one-sided." That sentence alone changed the tone of the room. This was not espionage for gain. There was no money trail, no coercion, no blackmail, no secrets traded under pressure. Klaus Fuchs had believed what he had done was not only justifiable, it was essential. The room, so carefully structured for confrontation, had become something else entirely. A confessional without guilt. A testimony without defense. At one point, one of the officers dropped his pen. It clattered too loudly against the floor. Fuchs didn't flinch. He simply continued. "You ask why I did not stop. I ask you, Why would I? You built the bomb to control. I passed it on to dilute that control. And then, perhaps most chillingly, he said, "It worked." Skardon asked about Harry Gold. Fuchs confirmed him. He was careful, meticulous. Not a friend, but a function. I knew his real name eventually. He didn't know mine. That was by design. When asked if he had ever feared being caught, Fuchs said something that stayed with Skardon long after the interviews ended. "Fear is for the uncertain. I was not uncertain." The MI5 file on Fuchs had already detailed some of the timeline. They had a list of meetings, a spiderweb of contacts, and the cryptic Venona cables referencing Charles. But it was only now, as Fuchs spoke, that the skeleton of the crime took on flesh. This wasn't guesswork anymore. This was architecture. And yet, as the hours passed and the interview stretched into a marathon of memory, there was one constant. Fuchs never named anyone currently active. He detailed dead handlers, defunct networks, operations long since closed, but when asked about any names still relevant, he simply closed the door. "I have told you enough," he said. "The rest is not mine to give." To the British officers watching from behind the mirrored glass, that line alone was both maddening and revealing. Even now, at the end of the unraveling, Fuchs was still shielding something. Not for himself, for others, for the idea. Word of the confession didn't stay within the walls of MI5. Within 24 hours, copies were being flown across the Atlantic. The Americans were livid. The FBI, who had begun its own investigation after the arrest of Harry Gold, had expected a final nail from the British. But not this. They wanted extradition. They demanded it. "This man sold out the entire Manhattan Project," one U.S. official said in a cable. He handed Stalin a blueprint to global parity. But the British had their reasons for keeping him. Legally, he had committed his crimes while under British employment. Politically, they did not want to hand over their spy scandal to another government. Emotionally, it was something more complicated. Fuchs was not just a spy. He was a mirror. And the reflection disturbed everyone. In Washington, General Leslie Groves, who had overseen the Manhattan Project, read the transcript and turned white. "He gave them everything," he said. "Not scraps, not hints, the core." Scientists who had worked alongside Fuchs at Los Alamos began questioning their memories. "He was so quiet," one said. "Too quiet, I suppose, but we thought he was just focused." J. Edgar Hoover, furious and under political pressure, pushed for indictments, but there was nothing more to indict in the U.S. Fuchs had operated overseas, and now Britain was holding him. The humiliation was total. In the days that followed, MI5 officers tried to get more from Fuchs. They showed him photographs, played recordings, asked for context, but the moment he had decided to speak, he had also decided where to stop. That line never moved. The press didn't know the full details yet, but rumors spread. A physicist, German-born, a communist, a spy. The pieces began aligning in headlines, in speculation, in fearful whispers that the Soviets had never been behind, but alongside the West all along. Inside his cell, Fuchs wrote, not to confess further, but to explain. Long, handwritten reflections about ideology, science, nationalism. "The bomb is not political," he wrote in one letter, "but the use of it is. I gave it away not because I hated Britain or America, but because I believed power must be distributed or it becomes a disease." He was visited by a chaplain. He declined spiritual counsel. He asked for more paper instead. His legal team began preparing for trial, but Fuchs barely engaged. "What I did," he told them, "was necessary. Your court may decide otherwise. That's its job. Mine was different." There was no theatrics, no attempted suicide, no pleas for leniency. When the trial date was set, Fuchs simply nodded. When told he could write a statement, he said, "I already have." In the corridors of MI5, the talk was no longer about how Fuchs had done it, but why no one had seen it sooner. He was always calm, one surveillance agent said, polite, brilliant, and so ordinary. That's what fooled us. He wasn't hiding under a rock. He was the rock. By the time Fuchs was transferred to await trial, the CIA had launched internal reviews. Los Alamos was being re-audited. New background checks were ordered for every scientist. The Cold War had entered a darker stage. Parity was no longer theoretical. It was real. And still, Klaus Fuchs slept. Not well, but not tortured either. He did not pace his cell. He did not pray. He did not weep. When asked what he expected from the trial, he replied, "Closure." The Americans did not forgive. The British did not forget. But Fuchs, he did not change. Even with his world collapsing, the cause remained intact in his mind. The silence that had followed him since childhood had returned, not as a shield, but as an echo chamber. What he had done would reverberate for decades. The arms race, McCarthyism, the Berlin escalation, everything that came after would carry his fingerprints, invisible but undeniable. He did not need a last word. He had already spoken the one that mattered: balance. The world tilted, and Klaus Fuchs had been the weight. The cell was silent, not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that doesn't invite peace, but swells like a pressure in the skull. That presses down on the eardrums until the world itself seems to lean inward. Klaus Fuchs sat on a narrow cot, not pacing, not scribbling, not even blinking much. Time had begun to distort the moment the sentence fell. 14 years. The number didn't matter. What mattered was that the scales had finally stopped moving. Or so the world thought. He had confessed everything. Not under duress, not out of fear, not even out of resignation. He'd confessed as though the final step of an equation had reached its conclusion, as though his mouth had merely caught up to what his mind had always known, that he would one day have to say it aloud. But now that it was done, and the trial had passed, and the names of the betrayed were murmured like an unspoken charge in the halls of MI5, something more dangerous began to unfold: the aftershock. While Klaus Fuchs retreated behind bars, the world outside vibrated with the consequences of what he had triggered. And the tremors didn't come gently. They arrived like a wave of cold warps surging through every capital in the West: Washington, London, Ottawa, Los Alamos, Moscow. The ripples bled outward, invisible but relentless. And the question that none of the politicians, scientists, or spies could seem to shake, even after the trial, even after the classified cables and the furious press briefings, was this: how much damage had already been done? They knew the Soviets had the bomb. They had known it since 1949, when the shockwave of RDS-1 rattled the windows of U.S. supremacy. But now they knew how. Not through raw Soviet genius, not through espionage in the abstract, but through the mind of a man who had once broken bread with Oppenheimer and laughed under the desert stars of New Mexico. The Manhattan Project was no longer just a feat of American ambition. It had become the ultimate betrayal from within. In America, the fallout hit hard. Within days of the Fuchs confession, the U.S. media began circling like hawks, and not around Fuchs, but around their own institutions. The Los Alamos Project had become a house with paper walls. Who else? The question echoed through the halls of Congress and the basement rooms of the FBI. It didn't stop with Harry Gold, or David Greenglass, or even Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, whose names would soon become etched into the American psyche like a fever dream. No, the confession of Klaus Fuchs lit a fuse that would burn all the way to McCarthy's podium. The Red Scare didn't begin with a bang, it began with a whisper, and Fuchs was that whisper. The idea that ideology could be stronger than nationality, that a man could sit at the highest levels of trust and still belong to another cause. It shattered illusions that had comforted Americans since the end of the war. And from that shattered trust emerged a new reality. You could never really know where someone's loyalty ended. The witch hunts had begun, books were banned, careers were burned, friendships dissolved under the acid of suspicion. And through it all, the image of Klaus Fuchs remained frozen like a ghost at the center of the storm, pale, calm, and already gone. But the British didn't extradite him. Despite American pressure, they kept him. He served 9 years, not 14, and even that seemed too generous for some. Yet, when the iron gates finally opened, and the man who had once handed nuclear secrets to Stalin stepped into the gray light of freedom, he did not disappear into shame. He walked east. The GDR welcomed him not as a criminal, but as a patriot. The East German government saw in him not betrayal, but devotion. In Leipzig, Klaus Fuchs returned to the world of theoretical physics. Not in exile, but in prestige. He was appointed deputy director at the Central Institute for the Nuclear Research. He gave lectures. He mentored students. He shook hands. Awards followed. Medals glinted beneath his lapel. And when he was photographed again, years after the scandal, there was no hint of regret in his eyes, only continuity. In the East, he was a hero, a man who had risked everything to level the playing field between superpowers. And in a strange twist of history, that perception began to harden into doctrine. School children learned his name as one learns Newton's or Einstein's, not as a criminal, but as a necessary correction to Western dominance. Fuchs never recanted, never apologized. When asked, he simply explained. He believed in balance. That belief had once been theoretical, like the physics he loved, but by the 1960s, balance had become the organizing principle of global survival. Mutually assured destruction, MAD, was not just a doctrine, it was the knife's edge the world danced on for decades, and without the early Soviet bomb, there might not have been that balance. Or so the argument went. Fuchs had not merely stolen information, he had in some people's minds stabilized the world by ensuring no one side could dominate the other. But for others, the cost was unbearable. The betrayal had sown seeds of paranoia that would take generations to uproot. Intelligence agencies ballooned. NATO was formalized with renewed urgency. The CIA, once a fledgling operation, expanded like wildfire, fueled by the conviction that another Fuchs could be hiding anywhere, in any laboratory, in any embassy, in any only lecture hall. The reverberations were global, but the center remained Fuchs. His legacy was radioactive. You couldn't touch it without being changed by it. And even after his death in 1988, even after the GDR buried him with honors and praised his unwavering commitment to international socialism, the West continued to parse his life like a cipher. They unearthed old files, declassified cables, interrogation transcripts. His voice, calm and methodical, detailing drop locations and dead letter boxes, was studied like scripture in the training halls of modern intelligence services. And yet, no matter how much was revealed, the full story never quite crystallized, because some of the names he protected were never caught. Some files remain sealed, some conversations were never transcribed. There are still blanks in the record, the shape of a shadow behind a page, contacts who vanished, meetings that left no paper trail. And when modern analysts tried to reconstruct the network Fuchs might have touched, they ran into walls of silence. It wasn't just about what he gave, it was about what he withheld. He had confessed to everything, but only everything he chose. And so the suspicion lingered long after the prison, long after the Cold War began to thaw. Even now, some believe Fuchs may have seeded multiple operatives who went undetected for decades. Others argue his true role was smaller than imagined, a cog in a much larger machine. But one thing no one disputes is this: his betrayal changed the trajectory of the 20th century. Because in giving the Soviets the bomb, Fuchs didn't just alter a military equation, he altered the psychology of power. Suddenly, the idea of unchallengeable dominance was gone, and with that loss came an age defined not by victory, but by deterrence. His files remain partially redacted. There are sections that end mid-sentence, ink that trails off, entire folders that were rumored to exist but never surfaced. MI5 denies nothing, confirms nothing. In Langley, a handful of documents still require special clearance. In Moscow, the archive on Rest, Fuchs's code name, is said to be incomplete. Some of the people he once met may still be alive, buried under different names, different passports, their stories never told. And so, the legacy of Klaus Fuchs endures not as a closed case, but as an unfinished one. A man who believed in ideology over identity, a physicist who thought justice was a formula, not a feeling, a traitor in one world, a patriot in another, and perhaps something else entirely, in the cold logic of history. But before the world moved on, before the chapters of nuclear brinkmanship and proxy wars, and disarmament treaties and espionage thrillers saturated the next 4 decades, there was one final moment, a moment no one recorded, but everyone remembers. The interrogation room, rain tapping faintly on the windows, a thick folder well worn at the corners, the last words from a man who had upended the balance of nations, not with bombs, but with trust. He looked at the officer across from him. The air was thick. No further questions came, just a silence. And then, softly, he said, "You thought I gave them a secret. I gave them balance." Under a gray morning sky in late 1988, a clerk in the British National Archives opened a file folder that had not seen daylight in over 30 years. The stamp on the cover read, "Top Secret, closed until 1988. The pages inside were brittle with time, marked with fading pencil notes, and the names within had once shaken empires. At the top of one page, the name Klaus Emil Julius Fuchs. For decades, he had been a ghost haunting the corridors of Cold War history, a traitor to some, a visionary to others, and to the intelligence services of 3 world powers, a riddle never fully solved. Now, as the world tilted toward the end of the Cold War, the curtain lifted on some, but not all, of what he had done. Yet, as the documents surfaced, a deeper unease emerged, because with every answer they offered, they raised 2 more questions. And somewhere between the pages, buried in margins and redactions, was the unmistakable hum of unfinished business. By then, Klaus Fuchs had been dead for nearly a year. He passed away in East Germany in January 1988, still wearing the mantle of a hero bestowed by the German Democratic Republic. No apology, no regret. He had been decorated with the Order of Karl Marx and other honors from the Eastern Bloc, his legacy curated by a regime that held on to him as a symbol of ideological purity, a man who gave the Soviet Union the key to the bomb. But death did not silence his story. In fact, in the months and years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, as Stasi files were smuggled out, and Soviet archives opened in fragments, the myth of Klaus Fuchs began to fracture, revealing not just a man who passed secrets, but someone who may have orchestrated a deeper deception than anyone had dared imagine. A former MI5 officer, gray-haired now, long retired, once responsible for trailing Fuchs in Harwell, sat down for an oral history interview in the early 1990s. The tape crackled as he spoke. "We always thought we had him boxed. We were watching his house, tapping phones, tracking his movements. But the deeper I look back on it, the more I believe he knew. Not just that he was under surveillance. He knew how to dance just outside our reach. He was playing us. And I think, God help me, I think he was always 3 moves ahead." Across the Atlantic, in declassified FBI memos, a different puzzle emerged. In a handwritten margin note beside a 1949 surveillance report, someone had circled a reference to an unnamed associate of Fuchs. The name had been redacted, not by the Americans, but by the British. A rare joint operation, tightly held, even in retrospect. When historians cross-referenced it with Soviet records released in the post-Soviet chaos of the 1990s, a pattern began to form. One that suggested Fuchs may not have acted alone, that he may have protected someone, another physicist, another trusted mind in the British Atomic Research Program, someone whose name never made headlines and perhaps never will. What made this theory more chilling was that the Soviets had hinted at it decades earlier, subtly, cryptically, in their internal intelligence assessments. A KGB memo from 1962, uncovered in a Moscow archive, referred to Agent Charles as the original source of reactor design schematics. The timeline overlapped with Fuchs, but Fuchs, in all his confessions, never mentioned a Charles. MI5 and MI6 launched quiet internal probes. Some files remained sealed. Others were shredded during a routine cull in the 1970s. Officially, there is no Agent Charles, but unofficially, the whispers grew. And then came the letter, dated December 1988, sent to a retired nuclear physicist who had worked alongside Fuchs at Harwell. The envelope bore no return address. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, compressed, Germanic. It read, "You once said I would burn history to the ground, but I only scattered the embers. You were watching the wrong door." The letter was signed, simply, KEJF. The recipient, shaken, turned the letter over to MI5. But by then, it was too late to question Fuchs, and too early to know what door he meant. In the years that followed, intelligence analysts pored over the timelines. One anomaly stood out: a brief power outage in 1947 at Harwell's isotope lab, just hours before a reactor control panel blueprint vanished. Fuchs had an alibi that night, but the technician on duty, a man who later moved to Canada and changed his name, was never questioned. His obituary appeared in 1995. Quiet, unnoticed, perhaps irrelevant, or perhaps the missing link. As the Cold War came crashing down and trust between nations mutated into suspicion within them, the legacy of ideological espionage refused to die. New threats rose in the digital age. In the early 2000s, a Russian cybersecurity unit was found to have embedded malware into Western power grids. The method, code originally designed to simulate nuclear reactor fluctuations. Code traced back to a now obsolete British software standard, one developed during the Harwell years. No direct link to Fuchs, but the echo was there. The pattern rhymed. Somewhere in the circuitry of espionage, his signature pulsed. By 2013, as whistleblowers leaked classified surveillance programs and governments pointed fingers at insider threats, the story of Klaus Fuchs gained renewed relevance. The erosion of trust from within, the betrayal, not by enemies outside the gate, but by colleagues, scientists, believers, had become the defining anxiety of modern intelligence. A retired NSA cryptographer, asked in an interview who shaped the modern age of espionage, didn't hesitate. Not Snowden, not Philby, Fuchs, because he showed the world you didn't need to smuggle blueprints out in your sock. You just needed belief and a clear conscience. Fuchs had once said, quietly, in a letter never mailed but preserved in a personal folder found after his death, that he feared a world where the balance of terror lay only in one direction. He believed that knowledge, once discovered, could not be contained. That secrecy itself was a lie societies told to preserve illusions of superiority. He believed in equilibrium, even if it came from fire. In one of the most haunting revelations from post-Cold War intelligence studies, a Soviet file revealed that the KGB had considered exfiltrating Fuchs from Britain in 1949, just before his arrest. The plan was codenamed Operation Lantern. It was abandoned at the last moment. Why? The file did not say, but the implication was clear. They believed he was more valuable as a martyr than as a defector. The arrest gave them plausible deniability. It silenced him in just the right way. Some historians now argue Fuchs may have known about the plan and may have let it fail on purpose. Because to him, going to prison wasn't defeat. It was the perfect end game. A confession that hid more than it revealed. A stage performance that kept the spotlight off the real act behind the curtain. And what of that curtain? In 2022, a final tranche of MI5 files was released, under pressure from academic and legal communities. Among them was a transcript fragment from Fuchs's last interrogation. Most of it was familiar, cold, calculated, exhausted. But one moment stood out. The agent asks, "Did you believe in the Soviet Union?" And Fuchs replies, after a long pause, "I believed in the necessity of a second hammer on the anvil. Whether that hammer was righteous or rusted, I did not ask." By the time that line reached public ears, the modern world had already descended into a new kind of shadow war. Cyber espionage, quantum encryption, biological data theft, intelligence services restructured, new acronyms born. But the fundamental lesson remained unchanged, that the most dangerous spies are not the ones who hide in darkness, but the ones who walk through the front door, file reports, eat lunch with colleagues, and carry conviction instead of cash. And so the story folds back into itself, into that interrogation room in 1950, rain sliding down the window. The man in the chair, composed, unshaken, signs his name, not with guilt, but with finality. The MI5 officer watching him finally asks the question that had been circling for months. Why now? Why tell us this? Fuchs turns his head slowly, gazes out the window where the raindrops race each other toward the sill, and says, "You were watching me, but I was watching you." The room goes silent. Somewhere, a clock ticks. A folder is closed. Years later, that folder sits in a digital vault, scanned, indexed, metadata attached, but its true content lingers in the quiet places, in the spaces between declassified lines, in the glances of men who know more than they say, in the locked drawers of aging analysts who still remember the face of a man who never raised his voice, never flinched, and never once looked back. And as the world spins on, satellite dishes tracking whispers, firewalls defending silence, a laboratory humming beneath a mountain where knowledge waits like a storm, the final voice belongs to him, soft, unyielding, eternal. A war of shadows never ends. It just changes shape. There's a sound most people miss. It's not the crack of a gun, nor the shatter of glass. It's quieter than that, more insidious. It's the whisper of paper, files being slid into drawers, documents stamped classified, conversations swept behind closed doors, never meant to be opened again. Klaus Fuchs lived in that silence. He moved through it like shadow, his footsteps absorbed by bureaucracy, by trust, by disbelief. When he died in 1988, East Germany buried him with honors, flowers, speeches, medals. A man once labeled traitor by the West was remembered as a hero behind the Iron Curtain. But the dirt hadn't even settled over his grave when new questions began to surface. Some whispered by defectors, others hinted at in declassified memos, a cipher left in a letter, a redacted name in a surveillance report. Fuchs may have died, but the network he belonged to, the ideology he believed in, did not. It merely adapted. The Berlin Wall came down. Files once locked away in Moscow, London, and Washington began to trickle into daylight. Some of them bore Fuchs's name, but not always in the ways anyone expected. There were letters dated long before his arrest that MI5 never saw. Reports suggesting British and American agencies were more divided about him than they admitted publicly. One internal memo, yellowed and brittle, simply read, "If he's playing us, we've already lost." But perhaps the most chilling detail emerged in a German archive in 1993, a surveillance photograph labeled unconfirmed. It showed Fuchs in a park, sitting beside a man the file never identified. Their heads were close, their hands still. Nothing in the photo screamed treason, but the analyst who found it noted one thing. The man beside Fuchs bore a resemblance to another British scientist, one who was never charged, never questioned, never even suspected. The file ended with a single phrase, typed in bold, "Silence is the perfect camouflage." Modern intelligence officers still study the Fuchs case, not because they admire it, but because they fear it. What haunts them isn't how much damage he did, it's how little resistance he met. He wasn't flashy. He didn't seduce secrets out of people. He didn't even lie well. He just persisted, day after day, quietly, without fanfare, without cracks. That's what makes the perfect spy. Not brilliance, not loyalty, but resolve. He told himself a story, and he believed it enough to live inside it for decades. That belief, more than money, more than threat, was his fuel. Today, satellite dishes rotate toward the horizon. Fiber optic cables hum under oceans. Firewalls blink behind steel. But the war of shadows never ended. It only changed its mask. Cyber intrusions, data theft, backdoors in software, stolen biometric patterns. The language is different now, but the grammar is the same. Insider threats aren't relics of the Cold War. They're the reason Cold Wars never truly go cold. Every mole plants a seed. Every defector leaves a trail. Every silence, whether born of fear or conviction, echoes louder than a confession. In 2012, a sealed MI5 vault was opened as part of a modernization project. Among the files was a forgotten transcript from 1950. It captured the final moments of Fuchs's MI5 confession, not the version the public saw, but the unedited log. As the agents gathered their notes and prepared to leave the room, Fuchs stood. He reached for his coat, looked toward the rain-streaked window, and spoke. Not to them, but as if into the void. One sentence, no flourish, no emotion. Just this. They were never secrets, just inevitabilities. And that's the horror, isn't it? That maybe he was right, because maybe Klaus Fuchs didn't change the future. Maybe he just revealed the one we were always heading towards. And maybe the man who betrayed the West wasn't alone. Not then, not now, not ever.